Do Churches of Christ teach an oppressive gospel, or do Calvinists? Let's talk about that. One of the many accusations leveled against Churches of Christ is that we teach an oppressive gospel where you're mostly unsure whether or not you're saved or you're lost. And the Calvinist response to that is, if you want true peace, you ought to adopt Calvinism, or as they like to call it, the doctrines of grace. It sounds nice, but it's far from it. Can Calvinism give true peace? What they don't realize is that many of the early Restoration leaders within Churches of Christ were former Calvinists. Take Raccoon John Smith, for example. Raccoon John Smith lived from 1784 to 1868. His biography was written by John Augustus Williams, and Mr. Williams consulted heavily with Raccoon John Smith as to the events of his life. And Raccoon John Smith had this to say about his time under Calvinism. His biography says, Raccoon John Smith believed that God from eternity chosen certain persons for eternal life, whom he would call in due time by his Spirit and save, and that, too, without any regard to their faith or their works, all others would be left to perish, notwithstanding their struggles for life. The thought that he was perhaps one of the reprobate would sometimes paralyze his heart like a touch of death. At other times, he dreamed that possibly he was one of the elect and could not be lost. And with this conceit, he would win a moment's respite from despair. So varied and severe were his trials. And so again, this is coming from a man who was under Calvinism. Based on that, does it sound like he had any peace? Absolutely not. I presented this information on TikTok, and James White actually responded to this information. He had a lot of weird peripheral things to say, but here was the gist of his argument.
You know, he talks about despair. Well, look, you can turn that either direction. There have been plenty of people I've talked to who held to a synergistic Church of Christ style understanding of regeneration, who were despairing because they knew they were still sinning.
This kind of reminds me of Bart from The Simpsons.
Then I guess you're a garbage man.
Well, I know you are, but what am I?
A garbage man?
Oh, I know you are, but what am I?
Essentially, this is James White's argument. Just a child's playground insult saying, I know you are, but what am I? I know people say my system's oppressive, but people also say your system is oppressive. And we can go round and round with that. The only difference, though, is that my system doesn't teach evanescent grace. What's evanescent grace, you may ask? In John Calvin's Institutes, he describes what evanescent grace is, and it's horrific. John Calvin says, hence it is not strange that by the apostle a taste of heavenly gifts, and by Christ himself a temporary faith, is ascribed to the reprobate. Not that they truly perceive the power of spiritual grace and the sure light of faith, but the Lord, the better to convict them and leave them without excuse, instills into their minds such a sense of his goodness as can be felt without the spirit of adoption. When he shows himself propitious to them, it is not as if he had truly rescued them from death and taken them under his protection. He only gives them a manifestation of his present mercy. That is so bad. Boiled down, this is what John Calvin is saying. God makes some people feel really saved. They may be doing lots of good works. They may be having a thriving ministry, kind of like Stephen Lawson, only to take it all away from him so that when they go to hell, it hurts even more. I'm not wanting to be irreverent, but this sounds like cosmic child abuse. Under Calvinism, does God sound like a good father? No, he sounds like an abusive father. The difference between Churches of Christ and Calvinism is this. We believe that when God says he desires that all come to a knowledge of him, that God means that. Jeremiah Nortier and Trey Fisher run a Facebook group called Church of Christ Exiles. And they present this group as if it's something where those who have experienced depression under Churches of Christ can come and receive peace. Because Churches of Christ are just so oppressive, you're saved by your works, and no one can bear that. To them, I say, those who live in glass houses ought to be careful when they start throwing stones. Those in Calvinism can never really know if they're actually saved.